Imagine you are walking down a street in one of the most important cities in the British Empire. The year is 1943. The city is Calcutta. And what you see around you is not what you would expect from a crown jewel of imperial ambition. The pavements are lined with bodies, not the bodies of soldiers killed in battle, not the victims of a bombing campaign, not the casualties of any enemy. These are civilians, farmers, fishermen, mothers holding infants who stopped breathing days ago, but who they cannot bring themselves to put down. Elderly men who have walked dozens of miles from their villages on nothing but river water and whatever green leaves they could strip from trees along the road. Children with swollen bellies and sunken eyes, so weak they cannot swat away the flies crawling across their faces. The stench is everywhere. Vultures, grown so fat on the dead that they can no longer take flight, sit in rows along the gutters, their wings spread in the afternoon heat. This is not a war zone in the conventional sense. No bombs have fallen on Calcutta this day. Japan has not invaded. And here is the thing that should shake you to your core. Bengal, at this very moment, still has enough food to feed its people. There is no shortage. Somewhere in this city, in government warehouses and military stockpiles, grain is sitting in sacks, waiting to be distributed to the troops and the stockpiles of Europe. Somewhere on the ocean, ships loaded with Australian wheat are sailing past India's coastline, bound for the Mediterranean, to fatten up stocks in anticipation of liberating the Balkans from Nazi occupation. 3 million people will die in this famine. And for decades, the British government will tell the world it was a natural disaster. It was not. This is the story of how one of the most powerful empires in human history deliberately engineered the deaths of millions of its own colonial subjects, used economic weapons so sophisticated they were invisible to the untrained eye, silenced every journalist, jailed every dissenter, and then wrote the whole catastrophe off as an act of God. It is a story about money, about war, about the cold arithmetic of empire, and it is a story that still has not been fully reckoned with, not in London, not in the history books most of us were handed in school, and not in the corridors of international power where the financial mechanisms that caused the Bengal famine are still in use in different forms today. Let us go back to the beginning. Bengal in the 1930s was a province already on its knees. That is the first thing you need to understand, because no catastrophe of this scale arrives without a history. 2 centuries of British rule had done considerable damage. The British East India Company, when it first seized Bengal in the 1700s, inherited what was by many accounts one of the wealthiest and most productive regions in the world. Bengal was famous for its muslin, a cloth so fine that European traders called it woven air. It produced rice, jute, silk, and indigo in abundance. Its artisans and weavers were skilled and prosperous. Within a few generations of colonial rule, most of that was gone. The textile industry was systematically destroyed to protect British manufacturers. Land was restructured under the Permanent Settlement of 1793 to create a class of landlords loyal to the crown, while the peasants who actually worked the soil were reduced to tenancy and debt. By the early 20th century, half to 3/4 of Bengal's rural poor were existing in what researchers would later describe as a permanently semi-starved condition. Their margin over bare subsistence was paper thin. Then came the 1930s and the Great Depression. Global commodity prices collapsed, rice prices fell, land values fell. Already indebted farmers fell deeper into debt, lost their land, and became landless laborers. By the time the Second World War began, Bengal was a province with 60 million people, most of them desperately poor, with no savings, no reserves, and no cushion against any economic shock. And then the war brought the biggest economic shock in the province's history. Here is where the story gets complicated and where the conventional narrative of the Bengal famine starts to fall apart. Most people, if they have heard of the famine at all, have been told some version of the following. There was a cyclone in October 1942 that damaged the rice crop. Japan had invaded Burma, cutting off rice imports. There was a fungal blight on the remaining crop. Speculators hoarded grain. The government was slow to respond. Tragic, but understandable, given the pressures of wartime. A combination of natural disasters and administrative failure. But here's what that version leaves out. Scientists at the Indian Institute of Technology published research in 2019 in the journal Geophysical Research Letters that analyzed soil moisture and agricultural drought data going back to 1870, covering 6 major famines in the Indian subcontinent over that period. Their conclusion was unambiguous. Every famine except one was directly correlated with drought. The Bengal famine of 1943 was the only one that was not. In fact, the region received above normal precipitation between June and September of 1943. The crop may have been reduced slightly by the previous year's cyclone, and a fungal disease known as brown spot did affect some areas. But Nobel Prize-winning economist Amartya Sen, who was a 9-year-old boy living in Bengal during the famine, and who spent much of his academic career studying it, calculated that food availability in 1943 was actually 13% higher than it had been in 1941, when there was no famine at all. A mere 5% reduction below the 5-year average. The food was there. People were dying because they could no longer afford to buy it. So why could they not afford it? The answer requires understanding a financial mechanism that most people have never heard of, and understanding it is essential to grasping what Britain actually did to Bengal. The mechanism was called profit inflation, and it was not an accident. It was a deliberate policy designed by one of the most celebrated economists in British history. John Maynard Keynes is remembered today as a progressive hero, the man whose ideas about government spending and economic stimulus supposedly saved capitalism from its worst excesses. What his biographers and admirers tend to gloss over is his long and intimate connection with colonial India, and what he did with that connection during the Second World War. Keynes had been involved with Indian monetary policy since his early career. By 1940, he had been appointed as a special advisor on Indian financial and monetary matters to both the British Chancellor of the Exchequer and the Prime Minister. In that role, he was tasked with solving a very specific problem. How do you fund a massive, unprecedented war effort when you are running out of money in a colony you're not willing to directly tax? Keynes had actually developed a concept for doing this in Britain itself. He called it profit inflation. The idea was simple in outline, but devastating in effect. You print large amounts of money to pay for military expenditure. This causes the general price level to rise. But wages do not rise as fast as prices. So, in real terms, ordinary workers are effectively paying an invisible tax. Their purchasing power shrinks. They consume less. The resources they can no longer afford to consume become available for the war machine. Keynes described this explicitly as a forced transfer of purchasing power from the mass of working people to the state. When he proposed this for Britain, the trade unions objected loudly, and Keynes backed down. Instead, Britain financed its war effort through a relatively equitable system of income taxes and bonds, with careful price controls to prevent runaway inflation. British food prices rose by around 18% over the course of the war. Painful, but manageable. In India, no such equity was applied. No such backing down occurred. In India, profit inflation was implemented in its most aggressive and unrestrained form, and it was implemented on a population with 1/30 of the per capita income of the average Briton, a population that was already one bad harvest away from starvation. Here is exactly how it worked. When Britain deployed troops in India and used Indian industry for war production, it did not pay for any of this in hard currency. Instead, it made purchases on credit, accumulating what became known as sterling balances, essentially IOU notes stored in the Bank of England. India could not access these funds during the war. They were frozen. At the same time, the Reserve Bank of India was permitted to treat these paper credits as actual assets on its books and to print Indian rupees against them at a ratio of up to 2.5 to 1. So the printing presses of India ran at full speed, night and day. Between 1938 and 1942 to 43, overall government expenditure in India rose from around 90 crore rupees to 667 crore rupees. The budget deficit exploded to over 400 crore rupees, more than 100 times the pre-war figure. All of this freshly printed money flooded into the economy, almost all of it directed at the war effort. It flowed into Calcutta's munitions factories, into military construction contracts, into the pockets of industrialists supplying the Allied forces with textiles and steel. Prices exploded. The price of rice in Bengal rose from 14 rupees per mond in December 1942 to 37 rupees per mond by August 1943. By the midpoint of 1943, rice prices were 5 to 6 times higher than they had been before the war. Wages for agricultural laborers and fishermen did not come close to keeping pace. In a matter of months, the rural poor of Bengal found that the money they earned could buy perhaps a quarter of the rice it had bought 2 years earlier. And they were already, remember, a population living at the edge of subsistence. This was not a spontaneous market failure. This was, in the words of Professor Utsa Patnaik of Jawaharlal Nehru University, an engineered profit inflation imposed on a captive population with no political voice and no legal recourse to extract the maximum possible resources for the Allied war machine. Patnaik's research, which draws directly on the writings of Keynes himself, shows that the policy of extreme demand compression in India was a conscious and deliberate choice, implemented specifically because the colonial government knew it could not be so brutal with the British working class that could vote, strike, and protest. As food prices soared, the colonial government made things worse at almost every turn. First, there was the scorched earth campaign. By early 1942, Japan had captured Burma, Singapore, Hong Kong, Malaya, and was advancing toward Bengal with alarming speed. British military planners feared an invasion through the eastern coast of Bengal. Their response was to implement what they called the denial policy. The word is sanitized, almost bureaucratic in its blandness. What it actually meant was this. The British Army went into the coastal districts of Bengal and methodically destroyed the economic infrastructure of the people who lived there, on the grounds that if Japan invaded, those resources should not fall into enemy hands. The denial policy had two main components. The first was the rice denial policy. Government agents swept through the surplus, rice-producing coastal districts of Midnapore, Bakirganj, and Khulna, and confiscated or destroyed all rice stocks deemed to be above local requirements. In practice, farmers were pressured and coerced into handing over their grain reserves, sometimes told that if they did not comply voluntarily, the advancing Japanese would take it by force anyway. The official figures suggest around 30,000 tons of rice were taken in this way, though evidence of corruption and excess by purchasing agents suggests the real figure was considerably higher. In any case, the surplus districts that had once supplied rice to deficit areas of eastern Bengal now had nothing to send. The second component was the boat denial policy, implemented in May 1942. The British Army was authorized to confiscate, relocate, or destroy any boat in coastal Bengal capable of carrying 10 or more passengers. 66,653 boats were impounded. In a region that functions like a vast water network where rivers and channels are the roads and the boats are the trucks and the carts, this was not simply an inconvenience. It was the destruction of the entire circulatory system of the economy. Fishermen lost their livelihoods overnight. Farmers could not get seed or fertilizer to their fields, could not bring their harvest to market, could not ferry laborers to the land that needed working. The rice that did exist in surplus areas could not be moved to where it was needed. The Famine Inquiry Commission conducted after the war acknowledged that the denial policy had a serious and devastating effect on local trade and transport. One British colonial official, the governor of Bengal, wrote to his superiors acknowledging that the withdrawal of boats had, in his words, seriously interfered with the economic life of the areas concerned, made it difficult to dispose of paddy and rice, and had deprived fishermen of their main annual income. He knew. They all knew. The adverse effects of the Scorched Earth campaign were clearly understood by the Viceroy, by the Secretary of State for India, and by the Commander-in-Chief of British forces in India. And yet when the Commander-in-Chief raised objections, Secretary of State Leopold Amery cabled back that the destruction, in his words, should be ruthless and should achieve without fail total denial. The people of the coastal delta paid for that ruthlessness with their lives. Now, layer on top of all of this another critical fact. Even as Bengal was being stripped of its rice by military denial policies, even as prices were climbing beyond the reach of the rural poor because of deliberate inflationary financing, Bengal continued to export rice to Ceylon. For months after the beginnings of the food crisis had become apparent to anyone paying attention, this was not the behavior of an administration scrambling to respond to an unforeseen disaster. This was an administration that had arranged its priorities clearly, and ordinary Bengalis were simply not on the list. When the province's own chief minister, Fazlul Huq, warned the British colonial governor John Herbert in August of 1942 that there was a rice famine in Bengal and that the situation was becoming desperate, Herbert ignored him. When senior military officers, including General Claude Auchinleck, Commander-in-Chief of British forces in India, and Admiral Louis Mountbatten, Supreme Commander in Southeast Asia, began sending urgent requests for food imports starting in December 1942, those requests were rejected or reduced to tiny fractions of what was being asked for by Churchill's war cabinet in London. India was also not permitted to use its own sterling reserves, frozen in London, to purchase food internationally. It was not permitted to use its own ships to import grain. Every resource that might have alleviated the crisis was locked behind a wall of wartime administration, and the key to that wall sat in London in the hands of Winston Churchill. Churchill's role in the Bengal famine has been the subject of fierce historical debate, and it is worth being honest about the complexity here. Some defenders of Churchill have argued that he was dealing with an enormous global war, that shipping was desperately scarce, that he was misinformed by the Indian colonial administration about the scale of the crisis, and that he did eventually take steps to send aid. These arguments are not without any basis, but they collapse when examined against the actual evidence. On the 4th of August, 1943, Churchill's war cabinet met to discuss the famine. By this point, people were already dying in the hundreds of thousands. The cabinet's response was to dispatch what Leo Amery, the Secretary of State for India, later described as a token shipment of 50,000 tons of wheat to be sent to Ceylon to await further instructions, alongside 100,000 tons of barley. Amery, who was among those pushing hardest for greater relief, called this offer hopelessly inadequate. At the same meeting, and in the weeks that followed, Churchill's cabinet approved the continued shipment of around 75,000 tons of Australian wheat per month to Ceylon and the Middle East to supply the war effort, and a further 170,000 tons were routed past famine-stricken India to a supply center in the Mediterranean. there to be stockpiled against the anticipated liberation of the Balkans and southeastern Europe. This was a choice. A conscious, deliberate prioritization of future European food security over present Indian lives. And the minutes of the War Cabinet make this explicit. Churchill stated that Indians were not the only people starving in the war. He asked how, if the food shortage in Bengal was truly so severe, Mahatma Gandhi remained alive. He told the War Cabinet that the famine was the Indians' own fault for, in his recorded words, breeding like rabbits. When the cabinet discussed the possibility of accepting Canadian offers of emergency food aid for Bengal, Churchill refused them because he felt the 2 months it would take for the Canadian grain to arrive was too long, and because he preferred to source grain from Australia. The Australian grain, however, was then routed elsewhere. When India appealed to the United States for help, the Roosevelt administration declined on the grounds that it needed all available shipping for the Pacific Theater and the impending D-Day landings. India, squeezed from every direction, starved. By the summer of 1943, the famine was at its catastrophic peak. An estimated 100,000 to 150,000 desperate villagers had flooded into Calcutta, sleeping in doorways, dying on pavements. The Famine Inquiry Commission later reported that many of those who collapsed in the streets and in emergency hospitals were so emaciated they resembled, in the Commission's own words, living skeletons. Starvation was the primary cause of death through the first phase of the famine, running from around May to October of 1943. Then disease took over: malaria, cholera, smallpox. Bodies that were too weak to fight infection, immune systems destroyed by months of near-total starvation, fell to illnesses that a healthy person would have survived easily. The social fabric of Bengal did not just strain, it disintegrated. Men sold their last plots of land for a few handfuls of rice and then had nothing left to sell. Women sold themselves to survive. Families walked away from their villages and never found their way back. Children were abandoned on roads by parents too weak to carry them, who believed, perhaps, that a stranger might have more to give than they did. Testimonies collected from survivors in the years that followed describe scenes that are almost impossible to hold in the imagination. One woman recalled that mothers had no breast milk, their bodies had become all bone, no flesh. Many children died at birth, their mothers too. Many wives whose husbands could not feed them killed themselves. Some women went with whichever man could feed them, and no one, she said, was in a position to judge. The vultures in the countryside grew fat. In rural Bengal, bodies lay on roadsides and floated in the rivers and ditches. Jackals fed on the still living. A Bengali artist named Chittaprasad walked through the worst affected areas of Midnapore and documented what he saw in a publication called Hungry Bengal, recording names, testimonies, and sketches of the dying. The British colonial authorities promptly seized and destroyed most copies of it, because that is the final layer of this story, not just the killing, but the concealment. Under the Defense of India Act of 1939, the colonial government had sweeping powers over the press. As early as the winter of 1942, when the first clear signs of the coming catastrophe were visible, official policy was to suppress all reporting of the food crisis. Internal government dispatches replaced the words famine and starvation with the softer and less alarming phrase food situation. Journalists were pressured not to publish images or accounts of the dying. The British public, and indeed much of the Indian population outside Bengal, was kept almost entirely in the dark. As the Statesman newspaper later noted, the United Kingdom government seemed virtually to have withheld from the British public knowledge that there was famine in Bengal at all. This went on for most of 1943. Month after month, as people died in their hundreds of thousands, official London described the situation in Bengal as a manageable food difficulty. The governor of Bengal, the viceroy, and the War Cabinet in London all maintained this public fiction, while privately acknowledging the scale of the catastrophe in their internal correspondence. The wall of censorship finally cracked in August of 1943. The editor of The Statesman, Ian Stevens, made what historians have since described as a singular act of journalistic courage. He commissioned a series of photographs of famine victims on the streets of Calcutta and published them on the 22nd and 29th of August. The images were devastating. Skeletal bodies, children with distended bellies reaching up toward the camera, families collapsed on pavements. The photographs went around the world. The Guardian in London called the situation, in its words, horrible beyond description. The Japanese and German propaganda machines gleefully made maximum use of them, broadcasting images of mass death in the second city of empire across occupied Asia. Public pressure built rapidly after that. Relief operations were finally escalated in October of 1943, when Churchill replaced the viceroy with Field Marshal Archibald Wavell and instructed him to treat the famine as a military emergency. Wavell, to his credit, moved with urgency, deploying military logistics to distribute food and forcing through supply requests that had previously been blocked. The winter rice harvest in December of 1943 provided additional relief, but by then, the worst of the killing was done. Over 3 million people were dead, and the cover-up continued. The Famine Inquiry Commission of 1945, set up by the British Colonial Administration, concluded that the famine had been caused primarily by the cyclone of October 1942 and the associated rice crop failure, combined with speculation and hoarding and the loss of Burmese rice imports. It assigned blame to local Indian merchants, to the provincial Bengal government, and to the general chaos of wartime conditions. The role of deliberate inflation policy was not examined. The denial policies were discussed, but treated as unfortunate military necessities. The systematic suppression of relief requests by Churchill's war cabinet was not highlighted. The Famine Inquiry Commission was not designed to find the truth. It was designed to produce a version of events compatible with continued British rule. To understand how deeply this cover-up ran, and how sophisticated the financial mechanism behind the famine really was, it helps to follow the money all the way to its destination. The sterling balances accumulated by India during the war, the frozen IOU notes that represented Britain's unpaid debts for all the grain, equipment, labor, and lives it had extracted from the subcontinent, eventually amounted to a staggering sum. When negotiations took place after the war about repayment, India's delegation pressed Britain to honor its debts, citing, with considerable understatement, the extreme suffering the population had endured. Britain's response was essentially that the suffering was in the past, and therefore irrelevant to present calculations. One member of the British delegation even suggested that writing off the sterling debt entirely should be made a condition of Indian independence. The proposal was ultimately rejected, but what followed was little better. The balances were divided, frozen, devalued by sterling's depreciation against the dollar in 1949, and released only in fragments over the following years. India never came close to receiving the full value of what it was owed. The forced loan that had helped pay for Britain's war and had helped starve 3 million people was quietly written off, reclassified, and forgotten. Meanwhile, the financial ideas that had produced the famine did not disappear. They mutated. Keynes went on from his role in Indian monetary policy to become the chief British architect of the Bretton Woods system in 1944, helping to design the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. He ensured, as the economist Jason Hickel and others have noted, that the colonies and newly independent nations of the Global South were integrated into these institutions with drastically reduced voting power compared to Britain and the United States. The structural adjustment programs that the IMF would impose on developing countries in the following decades, programs that demanded the compression of government spending, the removal of food subsidies, and the forcing open of markets to foreign capital, were recognizably descended from the same economic logic that had been applied to Bengal in 1943. The tools had been refined and made more palatable. The underlying mechanism, the forced transfer of purchasing power from the poor to serve the interests of the powerful, was the same. And here, in the broader sweep of this history, is the question that has never been properly answered, not by any British government, not by any international institution. If a policy is designed by a senior official, described in writing, implemented deliberately, and results in the deaths of 3 million people who could have been saved with food that existed and could have reached them, what do we call that? The word that historians and governments have generally avoided using is genocide. The debate over that term is fierce and legitimate. Genocide requires, under international law, proof of specific intent to destroy a group. What can be demonstrated with certainty in the case of Bengal is a combination of deliberate policy choices, repeated refusals to provide available aid, active suppression of information, and profound racial indifference. Churchill's private statements, recorded in the diaries of his own Secretary of State for India, make the racial calculus explicit. Indians were a beastly people. Their deaths were their own fault. The fact that people were dying in their millions did not prompt urgent action. It prompted a question about why Gandhi was still alive. What is not in dispute among serious historians of the period is that the famine was not natural, that the food existed, that the policies that caused the crisis were deliberate even if the deaths themselves were not all individually intended, and that the subsequent cover-up was conscious and sustained. The 1945 Famine Commission report was built on the premise that Britain needed to be absolved. Subsequent decades of Cold War historical writing, in which Britain and its wartime leadership were positioned as unambiguous heroes against fascism, made the Bengal famine almost impossible to fit into the prevailing narrative. If you are the country that saved the world from Hitler, you cannot simultaneously have engineered the deaths of 3 million Indian civilians. And so the famine was minimized, qualified, naturalized, and buried. It has begun, slowly, to surface. Madhusri Mukherjee's book, Churchill's Secret War, published in 2010, brought the story to a wider audience. Utsa Patnaik's economic analysis of the profit inflation mechanism gave it rigorous academic grounding. The 2019 climate science study definitively refuted the drought narrative. And yet, Britain has still never formally acknowledged what happened, let alone apologized for it. The famine remains absent from most British school curricula. Churchill remains, for millions of people, a heroic figure uncomplicated by his role in the worst peacetime death toll in the history of the British Raj. There is one final detail worth sitting with, because it says something about the nature of power and how it protects itself across generations. In 1943, at the height of the famine, the British government imposed strict rationing in Britain itself. Food prices in the United Kingdom were kept in check by subsidies, rationing controls, and government intervention. British consumers experienced roughly an 18% rise in food prices over the course of the war. Painful, inconvenient. The British public grumbled. Members of Parliament described even bread rationing as an intolerable deprivation. In Bengal, food prices rose by 300%. People died in the streets. The difference between the two experiences was not geography, not the availability of food, not the difficulty of shipping. It was a deliberate decision about whose lives were worth protecting and whose could be offered up as fuel for the war machine. That decision was made in offices, by educated men, using economic theory written in polished academic prose. It was signed off on in cabinet minutes with neat, measured language. And it killed 3 million people, slowly and from the inside out, in a famine that the world was not allowed to know was happening until the bodies piled up so high they could no longer be hidden. History remembers 1943 as the year the tide turned in the Second World War. The Battle of Stalingrad ended in February. Allied forces invaded Sicily in July. The Italian campaign began. Churchill stood on the global stage as one of the great defenders of freedom and human dignity against totalitarian barbarism. 3 million people in Bengal starved to death while he did it, and the world, for 80 years, mostly looked away. If you have made it this far, this story deserves to be heard by more people. Share this video. Leave a comment about what struck you most. Subscribe to the channel if you want to keep following these buried histories, because there are more of them, and they matter, and the only thing that eventually breaks the silence around them is the relentless insistence that they be told.